Welcome to Blurts and Spasms, a podcast by T. Collins Logan via SoundCloud. Session 3, an excerpt from the essay Compassion and Codependence. At opposite ends of the nourishment spectrum are compassion and codependence. Although they share some superficial characteristics and can sometimes be confused by even the most well-meaning and perceptive people, compassion and codependence actually directly oppose, antagonize, and interfere with each other. Confronting this reality can be unsettling, but is ultimately liberating. What follow are a number of ways to explore the nourishment dynamics of these two modes of being within the framework of integral life work, and thereby identify and transform such tendencies and patterns in our relationships. First, let's look at some of the similarities. Both compassion and codependence are modes of being that stem from a desire to heal or nourish on some level. And for both, it is important to distinguish each mode of being from actions or emotions with which they are frequently associated. Feelings of commiseration, kindness, or sympathy may be present in both modes, as can a strong desire to remedy wrongs, heal what is broken, or relieve suffering in some way. Actions may, on the surface, seem to be similar as well. For instance, giving food to someone who is hungry, or attention and emotional support to someone who is hurting, or praise and encouragement to someone who believes they are disempowered. But by definition, modes of being are not emotional states, states of mind, or even types of action. Modes of being are an expression of who we are at any given moment. They are a natural overflowing of our essential characteristics into the world around us in the most unedited and unfiltered ways. We are not striving to be compassionate or codependent, we simply are. These are the unself-conscious emanations of self that interact with everything around us. To understand how different these modes of being are, consider the common evolution of externally dependent relationships between romantic partners. In these relationships, the focus is on receiving nourishment from external sources, either through the conscious demands we place on others or by the unconscious expectations we have of them. The course of such a romance is predictable. First, there's a strong attraction and interest, a curiosity to understand, explore, and connect. And once there is mutual acknowledgement, other desires immediately begin to intrude, to be prematurely trusting and relax all personal boundaries, to quickly begin pleasurable intimate contact, to rapidly claim exclusivity or ownership in a public way, to monopolize each other's time and energy, dominating every activity and experience with togetherness, and ultimately to emotionally enmesh and no longer have self-confidence or even a well-defined identity separate from each other. These patterns can become obsessive to the point of what are clearly controlling, manipulative, and possessive behaviors. But as dysfunctional as the relationship has become, a tacit agreement has been reached that the mutual need for external dependence is satisfied, and neither party wants to risk losing that satisfaction by challenging the relationship's dynamics. Over time, a sort of equilibrium is reached, in which mutual benefits of the relationship are solidified. That is, the value and identity of togetherness becomes rigid and reflexive. The desirable or pleasurable experiences that were at first a matter of experiment and exploration become habitual demands. There must, according to externalized nourishment expectations, be regular intervals of shared experience, interaction, intimacy, demonstrated reliance, and so forth, for these reinforce the illusion of togetherness. And if these habits are interrupted or delayed in some way, it tends to cause fear, conflict, accusation, feelings of abandonment, and even self-destructive despair. When togetherness habits are suspended for any length of time, the relationship begins to unravel completely, with each person feeling isolated, injured, and abandoned to chaos and emptiness. Why? Because each party has become so dependent on the other that the only identity left to them is to become a helpless victim. Now let's turn to the characteristics of an internally empowered, independent romantic partnership. Here we acknowledge our own responsibility for self-nourishment and do not demand or expect another person to meet all our needs. These relationships are grounded in shared values, mutual appreciation, and goal alignment, but these conditions are less engineered or expected. Instead, they tend to happen spontaneously and serendipitously. The initial attraction, curiosity, and desire to connect may still be present, but these impulses are managed and prioritized within a different context, the context of interdependent nourishment. There is sharing, but it isn't a desperate, clingy sort of exchange. It is the easy giving and receiving that has no strings attached and which respects the personal boundaries of each party. There is shared pleasure, but it is celebratory rather than controlling or needy. There is honesty and openness, but it evolves casually and does not demand reciprocation or exclusivity. In an internally empowered, interdependent context, no one has responsibility over another's happiness, satisfaction, or well-being. There are beneficial synergies and beautiful harmonies that might not exist without the relationship, which is ostensibly the purpose of relating to each other after all. But there is no insistence on dependability, permanence, or rigid routine. There is less habit and more spontaneity. Togetherness is not an identity, but a celebration of each shared moment. So when interference with the connection occurs, when there is a separation or even an end to certain aspects of the partnership, there may be recognition of loss and a time of grieving, but there is no sense of injury or abandonment. There is no panic in the face of chaos and no descent into hopelessness or victimhood, because each person has remained whole within themselves. What is happening here? Why are these two modes of being so different? In the case of externally dependent relationships, our affection and commitment are conditional. We must receive certain benefits to sustain the association. In internally empowered, interdependent relationships, our affection and commitment are not conditioned on the benefits we received, but there is more to it than this. In externally dependent relationships, we have completely abdicated our responsibility to care for ourselves. We are not seeking a partner, friend, or soulmate. We are seeking a parent. We are perpetuating a childlike dependence on another person to feel safe, loved, and whole. At the same time, we are trying to become someone else's parent by allowing them to depend on us in the same way. In contrast, the parent-child dynamic is entirely absent in internally empowered, interdependent relationships. Each person is invested and skilled in caring for themselves with love, having become whole in the process, and thus able to share that whole, fully loved person with someone else. One mode is like a broken cup that can never be filled enough, and the other is like a flawless cup, endlessly filled to overflowing. And this is how we can define the former mode of being as codependent and the latter as authentically compassionate. Of course, in the intricacies of day-to-day life, most of us are constantly navigating many different circles of intimacy, and our modes of being are expressed differently in different circumstances. Just because I have a healthy interdependent relationship with my romantic partner does not mean I have a healthy interdependent relationship with my boss at work. The society in which we live insinuates roles, responsibilities, and other expectations into our various relationships as well. And then there are old habitual patterns established with family members when we were young, which still linger into the present. So can we ever be free? I think it is possible to first imagine our freedom and then to cultivate a sense of liberation through interior disciplines that empower ownership of our own well-being. And I think it is possible to transcend the counterproductive patterns of our parent culture and family of origin through rigorous practice of holistic self-care and techniques designed to overcome such barriers. These are some of the intended benefits of integral life work. The result is not freedom in the sense of complete independence, because integral disciplines tend to reveal and reinforce an underlying interconnectedness of everyone and everything. This freedom is more about realizing what choices we have before us, the consequences of those choices, and how to go about making them consciously and compassionately. Which brings us to defining yet another layer of what compassion and codependence really are. Authentic compassion cannot be sustained when its source has incomplete purpose, a wounded heart, or a broken will. And codependence likewise cannot endure a happy, content, and fully nourished life. And yet, both modes of being may be woven into our existence at different points in time, or in different arenas of interpersonal connection. So how can we distinguish one from the other? How can we encourage and train ourselves onto the healthiest course? Probably the most significant differentiator between compassion and codependence centers around personal boundaries. In integral life work, boundaries are what regulate self-nourishment. They define the limits of self and other in the context of relationship and how those energies interact. They allow us to function with a sense of safety and trust. If I have healthy, fully formed personal boundaries and am able to clearly and confidently express them, I am taking responsibility for nourishing myself. If I listen for, understand, and respect the personal boundaries of others, I am also allowing them to take responsibility for nourishing themselves. In both cases, I am acknowledging a fundamental feature of compassion, empowered self-nourishment. If, on the other hand, I have trouble defining my own boundaries or understanding and respecting the boundaries of others, my emotional responses and behavior will tend to be codependent, and my ability to self-nourish and permit others to nourish themselves will be incomplete. Here then are some examples of how personal boundaries function. Regarding the boundaries of others, in many Western cultures, we have a tendency to express boundaries in a forceful way. Stop looking at me like that, or who do you think you are touching me that way, or how dare you go through my things, or I can't believe you just asked me to do that. These are ways of expressing a perceived violation of the interpersonal trust that boundaries represent. However, not everyone is so direct. Sometimes facial expressions or body language are meant to convey a personal boundary. A disapproving frown, the breaking of eye contact, holding up a restraining hand, a subtle shake of the head, a slight turning away, a flush of embarrassment, and so forth are all means by which boundaries may be communicated. Cultural standards of personal interaction regulate many such boundaries. For instance, actions that are considered impolite, unethical, illegal, or perverse, or which generally fly in the face of social mores, are usually violations of culturally defined boundaries. We may not take off someone else's clothes without implied or explicit consent, for example. We may not take someone else's things. We may not intrude on someone else's personal life, and so on. And even though these boundaries tend to shift from generation to generation, or vary greatly depending on parent culture, social setting, and level of intimacy, or even evolve over the course of a relationship, they are always present in some form. Learning how to navigate the boundaries of others is a chief rite of passage to becoming an adult and in ongoing social acceptance. Understanding what actions or statements are socially appropriate defines us as trustworthy people. It can determine whether we are included in social gatherings or whether someone will find us appealing as a friend or a lover. And all such appropriateness is a matter of interpreting and responding to boundaries in different situations, and thereby gaining access to the nourishment we need, or providing it for someone else. This is a dynamic and highly valued skill in our society. Regarding our own boundaries, one way to describe personal boundaries of self is what level of interaction is comfortable for us and what alienates or offends us. Just as with the boundaries of others, our personal borders will shift over time and adjust to different contexts of interaction. How much we are willing to disclose about ourselves, for example, will depend on the situation, with whom we are speaking, and so on. It is always up to us to define and enforce those boundaries. We can't anticipate that even the most typical conventions will consistently be respected if we remain passive. Perhaps we don't appreciate a coworker's amorous advances, for example, or we may be flustered by a salesperson's attempt to gain personal information about us. We may sometimes feel we are being taken advantage of by a friend, and in each of these situations, if we don't assert our boundaries and communicate them clearly, a social trust could be violated. It is also important to recognize that each person has a unique set of boundaries that vary from the cultural norm. For example, one person is shy and concerned about their physical appearance, and another extremely open and unconcerned. Depending on how far to one extreme or the other our boundary deviates from a perceived social standard, we may become self-conscious about it or even feel guilt or shame. But on some level, we also know that feeling safe is necessary for us to nourish ourselves. Gazelle, pausing at the river for a drink, must be assured the lions won't eat them. We must find our own balance between personal boundaries that are too rigid and prevent nourishment, and boundaries that are so flexible or porous that we lose our sense of self. In either case, the feeling of safety and empowerment is something that we generate and is not something defined by others. How are these interpersonal boundaries formed? For most people, they're learned in early childhood through interaction with parents and socialization with other children. Many boundaries also seem to be natural reinforcement to innate individual characteristics. In integral life work, this combination of early social programming and predetermined tendencies creates something called chained associations. The result is a reflexive way of interacting with the world that is, for the most part, completely unconscious. There can be unfortunate deficits to chained associations. If our parents tended toward indulgent or authoritarian parenting styles, for example, or if they were more absent than present during our formative years, we may have underdeveloped, rigidly overdeveloped, or otherwise poorly functioning personal boundaries. And if our physiology skews our perceptions in some way, erratically influences our mood, or distracts us with strong impulses, our ability to form healthy boundaries for ourselves and perceive those of others will be limited. Then again, it is also true that chained associations can work to our advantage if we had a healthy, happy childhood, or if innate abilities enhance the awareness and self-discipline that interpersonal boundaries require. With that brief introduction, the essay Compassion and Codependence goes on to examine what codependence and compassion look like with boundaries and nourishment in mind. You can view the article in its entirety at integrallifework.com or tcollinslogan.com. Using the cup analogy again, if our cup has cracks in it and we can't maintain personal boundaries, we'll be incapable of nourishing ourselves enough to be whole. And if we are constantly pouring ourselves out for everyone around us and not respecting the boundaries of others, we'll likewise become empty. Thank you for listening.